Well, welcome to services this evening. Always pleased when somebody comes back after they heard me in the morning. Right, Nathan? Tonight we're going to be looking, as I mentioned this morning, we're going to be looking at some scriptures that show us that God's people were given information that they would not have been able to get ordinarily. So we're going to be looking at some information that maybe we found out in the last 100 years or less, and yet it was in the Bible as much as 1,500 years ago. I'm sorry, 2,500 years ago. So we're going to be starting, it's going to be a chain of scriptures that we look at tonight with very little comment. And I believe this is going to be streamed and also put on YouTube so that you can get the scriptures off of that if you like later on. We're going to be starting in Leviticus, the 7th chapter, if you'd like to turn over there. Leviticus, the 2nd chapter, 7th chapter, chapter 7. I'll give you time to locate each one as we're going through them. At one point, we'll see a little bit later in our reading, that God says he moves about the camp in order to protect the Israelites from danger and from disease and different harm. The first part of what we're going to be looking at tonight are going to be health concerns, things that the Israelites were told in the scriptures to do in order to stay healthy. So in Leviticus, the 7th chapter, starting in verse 16, it says, "The meat of his fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day that is offered. He must leave none of it till morning. If, however, the offering is a result of a vow or a free will offering, which must be a little bit different in the way it's prepared, then the sacrifice shall be eaten on the day he offers it, but anything left over may be eaten on the next day. Any meat of the sacrifice left over until the third day must be burned up, again to destroy bacteria." Our next scripture is the same chapter, verse 22. Leviticus 7, verse 22. "The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, do not eat any of the fat of cattle, sheep, or goats. The fat of animal found dead or torn by wild animals may be used for any other purpose, but you must not eat it." I believe that's called cholesterol. Something we learned about in my adult life, but there it is. And both my grandfathers died of heart attacks young, and one of the problems was, I think, eating a lot of fat and cigarettes. The next place we're going to look is still in Leviticus. We're going to be there a little bit this evening. Leviticus, the 13th chapter, verse 45. Leviticus 13, verse 45. Now this whole section is where God is giving Moses the laws that the people were to observe in order to keep them healthy and to keep order in the society. In chapter 13, verse 45, it reads, "The person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes, let his hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of his face, and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone outside the camp." So we didn't need Dr. Fauci after all, did we? This is exactly what the debate was, and here it is. Continuing on, verse 47, "If any clothing is contaminated with mildew, any woolen or linen clothing, any woven or knitted material of linen or wool, any leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination in the clothing or leather or woven or knitted material or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is a spreading mildew and must be shown to the priest. And the priest is to examine the mildew and isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it, and if the mildew is spread in the clothing or in the woven or knitted material or the leather, whatever its use, it is a destructive mildew, and the article is unclean. He must burn up the clothing or the woven or knitted material of wool or linen, or any leather article that has the contamination in it, because the mildew is destructive, and the article must be burned up. But if the priest examines, and make sure I'm not going too far here. I think we've covered what we need to on that one. The next one is the next chapter, chapter 14, verse 33. Chapter 14, verse 33. Again, we're on the issue of mildew, but this time it has to do with the dwelling where they live. Verse 33 says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your possession, and I put a spreading mildew in the house in that land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, I have seen something that looks like mildew in my house. The priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mildew, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mildew on the walls, and if it has a greenish or reddish depressions that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out of the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall go and inspect the house, and if the mildew has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. And he must have all the inside walls in the house scraped, and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside the town. And then they are to take other stones to replace these, and take new clay and plaster the house. If the mildew returns or reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and plastered, the priest is to go in and examine it. And if the mildew has spread in the house, it is a destructive mildew, and the house is unclean. It must be torn down, its stones and timbers and all plaster, and taken out of the town to an unclean place. And my understanding of that unclean place is where the refuse of the town is put and it's set on fire. That would be the valley of Gehenna. Verse 46, and anyone who goes into the house while it is closed up will be unclean until evening. Again, this introduces the idea of us having germs on us and what we do with that. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash his clothes. But if the priest comes to examine it and the mildew is not spread after the house has been plastered, he shall pronounce the house clean because the mildew is gone. To purify the house, he is to take, well, we don't need to go over that part there. The next one is in chapter 15, same book. It's on down in the page. Chapter 15. And I believe here we're talking about diarrhea, as near as I can tell. Chapter 15, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if any man has a bodily discharge, and the discharge is unclean, whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean. This is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness. Any bed the man with a discharge lies on will be unclean, and anything he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Whoever sits on anything that the man with the discharge sat on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. And if the man with the discharge spits on, I can't imagine this, but anyway, he spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Everything the man sits on when riding will be unclean. And whoever touches any of the things that were under him will be unclean until evening. Whoever picks up these things must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. And the man with a discharge touches without rinsing his hands, hand washing is introduced here, with water must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. And regarding the utensils, it says if a clay pot that the man touches must be broken, and any wooden article is to be rinsed with water. Fascinating how detailed God got with these instructions, isn't it? But these are the kind of things that kept them healthy. And I think it just confirms so much that is, I should say it confirms the scriptures for us so that we understand and can have full confidence in these things which happened about 1400 to 1500 BC, were things that God gave his people. The next place is the next book over, Numbers, chapter 19. Numbers, chapter 19. And when we get there, we're going to be in verse 11. Numbers, chapter 19, verse 11. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then he will be clean. It's in the last year that I remember reading an article about one of the surgeons back in about the mid-1800s who was trying to convince the medical society that they needed to wash their hands after they had touched or operated on a dead body, especially if they'd done an autopsy. And the medical community was so against this that they drummed this guy out of business, and he died ruined. And it was 30 or 40 years later that finally the medical society accepted the fact that we have bacteria that was going to hurt someone if they operated on someone after they hadn't washed their hands. We take this for granted today, but it's not. And if we only knew the Old Testament, we wouldn't have had this problem. The next place we're going is Deuteronomy, chapter 23. Next book over, Deuteronomy, chapter 23. When you get there, we're going to be in verse 12. Designate a place outside the camp where you are to go and relieve yourself, and as a part of your equipment, have something to dig with. And when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement, for the Lord your God moves about the camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy, so that he will not see among you anything indecent or turn away from you. We could have avoided all the plagues from the Middle Ages with this knowledge. But of course, it was a time where the Bible was not being read. It was chained to the pulpit. Now we're going to move on over to Judges. So going to the right a little bit, to Judges chapter 13. In verse 2. Now, this has moved up in time a little bit. We've gone from about 1500 BC to 1000 BC. And this involves the birth of Samson. In chapter 13 of Judges, verse 2, it says, a certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, you are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and have a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will conceive and give birth to a son. Isn't that amazing? Now, what was it, 20 years ago, or maybe 30, that we were told that if we're pregnant, we shouldn't have alcohol? Not 3,000 years ago. Okay, our next spot that we're going to go to is going to be Genesis chapter 7. Back to the beginning here, Genesis chapter 7. And when you get there, we're going to be in verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 7th day of the second month, and on that day all the springs of the deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The question is, who knew about the springs of the deep? This could only have come from God. They just simply didn't have any way of knowing about these springs. This will come up again. We're going to move to earth facts now, pretty much. And so the next place we're going to go is in Psalms chapter 8. Psalms chapter 8. And when we get there, we're going to be in verse 8. It says, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and all that swim in the paths of the sea. Just a reference in Psalms to the paths in the sea. Again, how would they have known? We know that now, but not at that time. They wouldn't have known that there were paths in the sea with currents in them. Let's move on to the right a little bit to Isaiah, the 40th chapter, Isaiah 40. When you get to Isaiah, the 40th chapter, we're going to be in verse 23, or 22, excuse me. Now we, again, have moved a little, moved a little bit in time. This is going to be about 740 BC. It's referring to God, it says, He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy, and spreads them out like a tent to live in. Again, referring to the fact that the earth is round. I think Columbus set out to prove that, didn't he? Again, in Isaiah, the 51st chapter. Turn over a little bit further. When you get there, we're going to be in verse 6. Lift it, in verse 51, verse 6 of Isaiah says, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth beneath. The heavens will vanish like smoke, and the earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants die like flies. My salvation will last forever, and my righteousness will never fail. This whole idea of the earth wearing out, I think that's become a concern in my lifetime at least, but not before. I don't think we thought much about this, that the earth was going to wear out, but now we know it does, doesn't it? In Jeremiah, going to the right a little more, chapter 8. Jeremiah chapter 8. Verse 7. Even the stork in the sky knows her appointed seasons, and the dove and the swift and the thrush observe the time of their migration. This was written probably around 620 BC. I live in the country. I can see 8 miles in one direction and 10 in the other, and I can't tell if the birds are migrating. I don't know how they would have known that if God hadn't told them. Again, the things we learn in reading the Bible. Let's go to Job. We have a few places in Job. Job 26. Turning back to the left, just before Psalms. Job 26, verse 7. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space, and he suspends the earth over nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. Fascinating that the earth is suspended over nothing. Maybe the UFOs that were coming in told them that. In case you've been watching the news lately. The next place that we're going to go, and there is an end to this, by the way, in case you're wondering. It's coming fast. The next place is Job 28:5. It says, the earth from which food comes is transformed below by fire. Sapphire comes from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. Well, maybe if they were near a volcano, they would have known this, but it wouldn't have been obvious to the person that the earth had fire beneath it. In Job 36, verse 27, we find another indication here. Job 36, verse 27. He draws up the drops of water which distill as rain to the streams. That is not obvious. Do you all remember learning that in school and wondering, how do they know that? This whole distillation process. Well, somehow they knew it back then, or God told them. Job 31, verse 37, verse 9. Another thing that just amazes me. In 37, verse 9 says, the tempest comes out from its chamber, the cold from the driving winds. The breath of God produces ice, and the broad waters become frozen. He unloads the clouds with moisture. He scatters his lightning through them. And at his direction, now I just can't imagine this next thing coming, but at his direction they swirl around over the face of the earth, whole earth, to do whatever he commands. It's only been in my lifetime that we could see this on television and see through the Doppler radar, whatever they're using, the swirls that we see in the winds around the earth. There's just no way they could have known. 38th chapter, verse 16. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? They have no way of knowing about these caverns in the deep. And yet, here we have it as a fact. The last one is going to be in the New Testament, in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to be in verse 3. This is the chapter on faith. And here he's challenging their faith by saying that by faith we understand that the universe was formed in God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. That is atomic theory. Atoms and molecules we cannot see, but they make up what we have. I don't know when I got this set of scriptures. I think it was from several trips through the Bible when I was teaching the daily Bible several years ago. I started to pick up on these passages that I think show, especially a person who has a hard time believing, it shows them that God was always there. And God was working with the people in the Old Testament many years ago. Sometimes it's hard to accept. I think for a person coming out of the world, it's very hard to accept that God has been active with these people all these years. We have the miracles, but sometimes that doesn't faze somebody. But to see these facts brought out so many years ago, and so absolutely accurate, has to help our faith. And it's just one of those things that we can put in our arsenal when we are teaching someone that God has always been there. Well, I hope these things have helped a little bit, and maybe it will help you with your life or with some of your relatives or friends that you're studying with. We have so many things at our fingertips, and it's such a comfort to know that God has taken care of his people all these years. If you have any needs that you need to bring in front of the congregation, why, I invite you to do that as we stand and sing.